I'm Brian Newton, current president of the Natchez Trace Genealogical Society, and see some faces that I know that we haven't really seen much over the last couple of years, and a lot of new faces that we haven't seen before. So welcome everybody. We're glad everybody's here.
Thank you so much, Kitty. Thank you. Thank you all for being here. Thank you to Brian and Kitty for having me back to have a do-over. And again, if any of you showed up in August expecting me, I apologize sincerely. The right hand didn't know what the left hand was doing. Well, and you touched on a lot of my biography, so I'll spare that, except to say that I am Lee's deputy. I'm the assistant local history and genealogy librarian here at Florence Lauderdale Public Library. It's my pleasure to be. It's a great pleasure to serve this organization and this community in that capacity. You may not know it from listening to me, but I assure you I am a native of Lauderdale County, Alabama. My family has lived here since about the 1820s, so I am as local as you can be without also being a Chickasaw or a Cherokee descendant. The program today will have three phases. First of all, we'll talk about a basic overview of Tennessee River geography. We'll zoom into the Muscle Shoals and zoom in specifically to the geographical features of that 40-mile stretch of North Alabama. And then in the final section, we'll discuss the way that human beings interacted with that river, especially in the period of European-American settlement in the area, and how that ultimately completely transformed the river from its natural state into the river that we see today. Now, since this is the meeting of a genealogy society, I felt the need to tie all of this back into genealogy in some way. My interest in the topic comes ultimately out of my interest in the Civil War, which comes out of my personal genealogy research. The woman you see here on the top right corner, she's arguably the reason that I'm here talking to you all today. This is my fourth great-grandmother, Bethany Wright Gray. After college, I started to research my genealogy in depth, and I was absolutely awestruck and fascinated by her story. And I will, if you'll indulge me, I would love to tell you a little bit of her story because it's very fascinating. She became a widow in the last week of October 1864. Her husband John died on the 28th of October 1864, leaving her the single mother to 10 children. And a week later, the Union cavalry under General Edward Hatch encamped near her home on Blue Water Creek and proceeded to take everything she had to live on. From the corn from the cribs, from the bacon from the smokehouse, they shot and killed the pigs in the field. They even took the cooking utensils from her kitchen. And this discovery, because I grew up on Blue Water Creek and I'd never heard this story, this discovery led me to embark on a serious study of the Civil War in the Shoals in Northwest Alabama in order to be able to explain why this happened to her. And arguably, that's the reason why I have the job that I have today. And so we can thank her for my presence here. Then my other fourth great-grandfather, John Wilson Michael, he was another petitioner to the Southern Claims Commission, which I'm sure many of you are familiar with, these documents that preserve their experience during the war. He says, well, first of all, he was conscripted by Roddy and taken to Tuscumbia in 1863, and he and 3 other men stole away. They took a canoe and rowed across the Tennessee River. He says, I took a furlough of my own Christmas Eve night and stole a canoe on the other side of the Tennessee River and come home to his home and his family back in Lexington. Now, the Tennessee River that he talks about here, what would have been intimately familiar to him in his life, is nothing like the Tennessee River that we know today. And the more you delve into these historical documents from the 19th century, the more you realize how different it was, and features that were so strategically important in the progress of the war. Places like Lamb's Ferry or Bainbridge Ferry no longer exist today. And so whenever we realize that the world that they knew, not only the cultural world, but the technological world, and even the physical world has vanished, in order to appropriately understand the experiences of our ancestors here in Northwest Alabama, it's necessary for us to understand the world in which they lived, and the physical geography, especially of the river that was so central to their lives here. Now, the Tennessee River is the most significant tributary. It's the longest tributary of the Ohio River. It begins at Knoxville, Tennessee, at the confluence of the Holston and French Broad rivers. This is about 813 feet above sea level. It drains an enormous area on the western slopes of the Appalachians with a trellis spider web of tributaries like the Holston, the French Broad, the Clinch, the Watauga, the Sequatchie, the Hiwassee. It flows relatively southwesterly and enters the state of Alabama and continues its course southwesterly until it reaches Gunnersville, where instead of joining the other rivers, like its sister river, the Coosa, and joining the Gulf of Mexico, it sharply turns northwesterly, and it makes an arc up through the state of Alabama and turns directly north to flow into the Ohio in what is often called the Great Bend of the Tennessee River. Now, I have read that no other river in North America flows northward for so long, except for the Mackenzie River up way in the Arctic of Canada. So it is a river that subverts our expectations of the way it ought to behave. Its mouth is at Paducah, Kentucky, which is 302 feet above sea level. The river miles from Knoxville to Paducah are 652 miles, and it drops 511 feet in that distance, which is an average of just over 7.07 feet per mile. The drainage basin is also called the Tennessee Valley, which we're familiar with, which covers 40,876 square miles. That's larger than the country of Iceland. It's larger than Portugal, larger than South Korea. It is an enormous region. As well, the word Tennessee is likely a loan word from the Cherokee language, the word Tennessee, which was an important settlement on what is now called the Little Tennessee. The river, however, in early modern times bears a huge variety of names. It's sometimes also referred to as the River of the Cherokees. And it's important for us to note that the Tennessee River is closely and inextricably linked to the culture of the Cherokee Indians in the Appalachians of the Southeast. The Tennessee flows through 8 counties in Alabama. From east to west, that's Jackson, Marshall, Madison, Morgan, Limestone, Lawrence, Lauderdale, and Colbert. And it drains land as well in 7 others, which are DeKalb, Etowah, Blunt, Coleman, Winston, Marion, and what did I leave off? Franklin. So the important thing for us to remember here is that this is a very significant river in terms of the region, in terms of the identity of our region. And the Muscle Shoals are arguably the most distinctive feature of the lower section of the river. The river, not only in being significant to human habitation, is a cradle for an astonishing variety of life. According to the website rheiniswasser.eu, the Southeast is a hotbed of aquatic biodiversity, a region with a variety of freshwater wildlife that is practically unparalleled in the temperate world. Some conservationists have likened it to an underwater rainforest. The Tennessee River is one of the most aquatically biodiverse river systems in North America. It is also habitat for the largest nesting population of bald eagles in the United States. The Tennessee River Basin as a whole is home to so many species of wildlife that the Nature Conservancy considers it to be the single most biologically diverse river system for aquatic organisms in the United States. And this would have been especially true before the creation of the dams, and especially true at Muscle Shoals. So whenever I say Muscle Shoals, what does that mean? What were the Muscle Shoals? Well, these days we know it as the region where we live, which is a conurbation of 4 cities, Florence, Sheffield, Muscle Shoals, Tuscumbia, and many outlying communities. But if you were to talk to someone in the 19th century, they would have understood this exclusively as a feature of the river. Shoals are shallow places in any body of water. And the Muscle Shoals specifically were a section of rapids, islands, reefs, and shallows in the Tennessee River, stretching from Browns Island, downstream of Decatur, all the way to Patton Island, which we can see today here at Florence. That's a distance of nearly 40 miles. In that distance, in 40 miles, the riverbed dropped 130 feet in elevation. Now, if you can imagine a waterfall, 130 feet tall, and then you stretch it out over 40 miles, that's very much a good picture in your mind of what the shoals were like. So it was like a cascade of water over a staircase. And you can see some lovely images here. The one on the bottom right comes from America's Gibraltar, published in 1916, which has beautiful colorized photographs of the Muscle Shoals region right at the cusp of the creation of the dams. An overview of what this section was like before we go into depth with it. There were scores of islands, hundreds of islands. Some were tiny, some were big, some were named, some were unnamed. Some of them were more or less permanent. Others came and went with the rising and falling of the water. The water was extremely swift because, of course, it's falling so fast in elevation that it's rushing very quickly. And so for that reason, it was practically impossible to get a boat up over that. Now, going downstream was possible, but it was also very dangerous indeed. There was only one bridge over the Shoals, which is what we call the Old Train Bridge, which was built in 1839, and the stone pillars are original. You can still see those today. In the absence of bridges, people generally used ferries to get across the river. Ferries, of course, are just small boats that take people from one side to the other, people, wagons, goods, livestock. Now, a serious question that we have to grapple with here, first of all, is how can we know what the shoals looked like? Short of actually getting in our time machine and taking our drone along with us and looking down on the river in 1840 or whatever, how can we really know what the river looked like? Now, as with all historical research, genealogical research, we depend on documents contemporary to their day to give us an idea of what things were like then. And so, besides like memoirs or eyewitness accounts, the number one source that we have, obviously, for what the shoals look like are maps. These are some of the earliest representations of the shoals that I have chosen to show for you. The one on the top left here from 1804, I hope that you notice that this map is much more symbolic than literal. Now, ultimately, all maps are symbolic, but the creators of this map did not necessarily seek out to portray on this map a one-to-one representation of what this was like in the real world. Generally speaking, the tributary streams, they follow roughly the same cardinal direction that they do in real life. But you can't look at that and assume that because there's a bend here in this creek, then there's going to be a bend there in real life. It's a highly figurative representation. Now, the map on the lower left from 1817, right at the beginning of white settlement in this area, this was produced by Peel and Sononer of Philadelphia, the Sononer who laid out the city of Florence, is a much more accurate representation. It is leaps and bounds ahead of the first one that we looked at. Now, it's still not quite perfect. You may be able to tell that they have a fondness for squiggles. So they depict the islands as all having squiggly lines, and the streams and creeks and tributaries are generally, what we know now from modern maps, are very accurate, but not 100% accurate. If you were to try and use this map to find your way around in the real world, inevitably you would come up with some discrepancies that would be problematic. And then finally, this map I'll point out here from 1834, produced by Guillaume Tel-Poisson in Paris. He was one of the surveyors, whenever, we'll see in a moment, the first attempt at making a canal at Muscle Shoals, hired to make a survey of a possible canal here at the Big Muscle Shoals. There is an attempt to show the topography here, but in my opinion, the 1817 map is better, based on what we know about other features that should be there that aren't. For example, there is no Bainbridge Ferry, as we'll see in a moment, which was a feature that we know was there, which Poisson does not show. Now, the end of the 19th century starts to produce maps like this one, which I have at the entrance, which the library has very graciously printed off for us to have as part of our collection. That was produced by the Army Corps of Engineers from surveys that were taken on the ground. This map dates to 1885. And because this map was actually surveyed, it does give us a very accurate representation of what the shoals looked like at this time. It's helpful for us because it will break them down into 3 main sections, which we can explore in depth. From upriver to downriver, we have the Elk River Shoals at the mouth of Elk River, obviously enough. Then there's the Big Muscle Shoals. And then finally, right here in front of Florence, we have the Little Muscle Shoals. And I have some insets here showing the incredible detail of this map. They've really taken pains to add these hash marks that show the exposed rocks and reefs. Again, this is a very figurative depiction of the river. Now, there really is no way that you could notate every single rock in the Muscle Shoals, but they've done a very good job showing the main features. Better still, by the turn of the 20th century, the U.S. Geological Survey began to make surveyed maps of the area. And from that, we get the 1914 and 1916 topographical maps, which I consider to be the authority on what the shoals actually looked like. We can use these with a high degree of reliability to say that if a feature, for example, measures 1¼ miles on this map, we can be relatively assured that it would be 1¼ miles long in real life. And we see some of these same headings, the Little Muscle Shoals, Big Muscle Shoals, Elk River Shoals. This map, unfortunately, doesn't carry on any further upstream than the mouth of Elk River. So the 1885 topographical map actually carries on to Browns Island. So we're going to use these now to dive in, so to speak, to these different sections and analyze their geographical features more closely. So first we have Elk River Shoals. These numbers I was trying to double check this morning. I will confess to you that math is not my strong point. So if you see an error in my numbers, let me know and I'll correct that. I do not mean to mislead you. From the foot of Browns Island, which Browns Ferry is just up from there, which the nuclear plant is named after, from the foot of Browns Island to Nance's Reef, we're talking about a distance of approximately 6 river miles. Now, the 1885 map, which shows the profile of the riverbed as they were building the canal, it indicates a drop of about 16½ feet in 3.5 miles from the foot of Browns Island to the mouth of Elk River. And that works out to an average of 4.7 feet every mile. That's a drop of 4.7 feet every mile through this stretch of river. Now, some of the features that you see here, there's an enormous island in the south bend of the river here along the shore in what is now Lawrence County called Gilchrist Island, and it's separated from the mainland by a narrow channel that runs along the headland. At the mouth of Elk River, you see all of these different islands, and they have really colorful names like Sweet Gum Island, Sedgegrass Island. There's also Harrison Island, which it seems to form like this sinuous delta of the Elk River there. Now, I also have included in the lower right the same stretch of river as it appears today as a point of contrast to show you just how dramatically it has changed. But there are also some fixed points of reference that we can still recognize, which I have pointed out. This particularly prominent little knob of terrain here is still above the water at the mouth of Elk River. You can see it on Google Maps imagery. And then on the north bank of Elk River, right at the confluence, you can see on the 1916 topographical map that it's a very sheer wall of bluffs that now comes right up against the river as it did then. Now, moving downstream, we reach a section of relatively narrow water where there was a ferry, Lamb's Ferry. Lamb's Ferry is very significant in the Civil War. People cross back and forth there all the time because the river is just under 4/10 of a mile wide at this point. So the narrowness of the stream made it a natural choice for a person to operate a ferry. And according to Sandra Sockwell, the first ferry was in operation no later than 1822 at this spot. And this stretches from Nance's Reef to the head of Tick Island, which is about 4 miles. The 1916 topographical map here shows a river elevation, so where the riverbed was about 520 feet above sea level. And the bluffs on the south bank here range between 600 and 620 feet above sea level. So the bluffs on the south bank are 100 feet above the riverside. Then we reach really the main section of river here, the Big Muscle Shoals. I have a quotation here from 1913 talking about the stretch of Muscle Shoals. In no major section is the average slope greater than 1 foot to the mile. Now this is in the downriver part of the Tennessee past the Shoals. Except for the stretch from Riverton to the head of Culbert Shoals, which averages 2.87 feet per mile. And the portion between the foot of Muscle Shoals and the head of Browns Island, which is this, which averages a drop of 3.57 feet per mile. So this is comparatively very steep compared to the rest of the river, as we discussed initially. I have noted here on the upstream side, the future site of Wheeler Dam. Now, the 1916 topographical map shows a river elevation of 521 feet above sea level, right at the head of the shoals, and then 436 feet downstream at Bainbridge, which is a difference of 85 feet. Now you'll also notice the contour lines, these red lines that go across the channel. Each one of those lines indicates a difference of 20 feet. So every time you cross one, the river has fallen another 20 feet in elevation. From the foot of Tick Island, which is the very appropriately named island here on the South Bank, it definitely does look like what it purports to be, to Bainbridge Ferry is 16 miles. At its widest, the river is about 1.1 miles in width. Now, this varied greatly depending on the stage of the water. If it was a flooded time, for example, it would be more or less. The Army Corps of Engineers map shows a drop of 84.6 feet, which averages 5.29 feet per mile. So 5 feet every single mile the river is going to fall. Now, as I mentioned, some of these features are too small, too insignificant, I suppose, to have had permanent names. They still show them on the map, more or less representative of the fact that there were rocks and bars and things out in the river. But again, they may disappear whenever the water were to rise, or more of them may appear whenever water levels were especially low. The most significant feature downstream of Tick Island, you see Jack's Island here. And then right at the mouth of Blue Water, both the 1885 map and the 1916 topo map show this very elongated cigar-shaped island, neither one of which they give a name to. Now, my Civil War research has indicated that there are other named features here. For example, in February of 1864, as the Tennessee River was sort of the no man's land in the Cold War between the Union forces on the north side and the Confederates on the south, Brigadier General Grenville Dodge reported, citizens report that 400 or 500 rebels crossed to this side of the river near the mouth of Blue Water at the Cane Islands. Now, there is no Cane Islands on this map, but apparently people at the time referred to some of these small islands as the Cane Islands. They say they have considerable stock on these islands. Whenever he says stock, he means livestock. So things like cattle, horses, mules, things like that. So the islands must have been substantial enough that you could graze cattle and horses on them. The rebels were hiding them on the islands in the middle of the river. And then you start to see larger features of the river. So we have Cox Island along the north bank. There's Peach Island, Little Peach Island, the twin islands of Resting and Walker Island. And then you get to this rather sort of a basin here right at the mouth of Shoal Creek. And the river begins to narrow precipitately at this point. The narrowing of the river at this point downstream of Big Muscle Shoals we call Bainbridge Ferry. It's also called Campbell's Ferry on early maps. And again, let me point out these contour intervals here. You see 20 feet in this distance here. That's 2.4 miles. Now, whenever I talk about an average of 5 feet or what have you, locally there is a great degree of variation, and Bainbridge was one of the places where there seems to have been the greatest difference. So in 2.5 miles, the river dropped 20 feet. The narrowest stretch of river here, that's right at 3/4 of a mile wide. It's 3/4 of a mile long and 2/10 of a mile wide. I looked on Google Maps, that's about the same distance as standing on the corner of Court Street in Hermitage and walking to the corner of Wood Avenue in Hermitage. That's how narrow the Tennessee River was at this point at Bainbridge Ferry. And people crossed back and forth repeatedly during the Civil War at this point. And it was an obvious choice because it's so narrow. Now, these bluffs here on the north bank are 620 feet above sea level, which at this point is almost 200 feet above the riverbank. Where this corresponds to in the modern day, this is kind of like Kendall Gardens, Sky Park, those neighborhoods over there. It's slightly upstream of Indian Springs. This protrusion here is also very significant, this protrusion on the south bank. It's nearly a mile at its widest and more than 2 miles protruding into the Tennessee River, and it's pierced down the middle by McKiernan Creek.
T.B. Larimore told some of his Marshall Academy students that during the Civil War he was a Confederate scout, that he swam the river at Bainbridge.
Well, he probably did. I imagine that the current was very swift moving considering that it dropped 20 feet and 2.5 miles, but you definitely could. That's the close enough distance that you could. I will also say in low water, you most definitely could walk across the Tennessee River. They oftentimes talk in the Civil War records about the river being fordable. When they say fordable, that means you can go across it on horseback. And the river was throughout North Alabama oftentimes fordable. But the level of the water would vary so greatly between the dry season and the rainy times. Like in February and March are oftentimes whenever the worst floods would happen. No one's getting across at that time. But of course in August or July, whenever we're not having, or in October, we're not having so much rain, and then the Shoals is very shallow.